Over the last few weeks in the U.S., we have seen the House hearings about the assault on the Capitol, an attempt on a Supreme Court justice's life, and right-wing extremists caught plotting to disrupt a Pride event this month. Now, the American people are seemingly more divided than ever as political violence reaches a fevered pitch around the country. So to talk a little bit more about this, we want to bring in UCLA Law School professor Eugene Volokh. Thanks for joining us. It just occurred to me that this phrase, we are more divided than ever before, I feel like we've said that before. I feel like we say that often, and depending on the times that you've been living in, you may feel like this is the worst of times. Mm-hmm. But the truth of the matter is, just most recently we saw a plot to kill Justice Brett Kavanaugh thwarted, if you will. The man who was in his neighborhood said he needed psychiatric help, called 911 himself and asked for help. But nonetheless, it's very concerning. And I want to ask you, what does this say about, the state of the U.S. when we have somebody, roaming the neighborhood looking for a Supreme Court justice, or we have a mob of people building a gallows and screaming, kill the vice president?
Well, it's all very bad. It was very bad, obviously, when there was an attempted shooting at the congressional baseball game of the Republican leadership, in which I think Representative Scalise was seriously injured. He was shot several years ago. So this is something that unfortunately does seem to be happening quite a bit recently, both at the levels of high politicians and lower levels. Obviously, obviously there was the riot at the White House, but before that there were all sorts of riots at police departments and federal courthouses and other places, including vandalism and arson. And in fact, there were killings during that as well, although not targeted killings of political leaders. It's very bad, and it's very bad for democracy. I mean, it's possible for democracy to diminish the risk to political leaders and to judges and others, basically lock them up, kind of like the president is locked away with heavy protection, very hard for him to lead a normal life, very hard for him to interact normally with normal people. But that's not good for democracy. We want, especially elected representatives, to go out there during election campaigns and otherwise to talk to ordinary voters. We want justices to be basically ordinary people living ordinary lives. It's very hard to do when there's this risk of political violence.
So, Professor, you clerked for Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, and it goes to the point that Anne-Marie was making earlier, which is that it does feel as if we're more divided than ever, but we have had
I think of the late 1960s. That's what keeps coming back to me.
We had a president assassinated in the 1960s. Yeah. We had a president assassinated in the 1860s. We've had multiple attempts on presidential candidates. Yeah. An attempt on President Reagan's life. There was a plot to kidnap President Lincoln that was, busted up before that happened. I mean, the question is, Professor, are we really any more divided than we've ever been when we fought a civil war? Or is it that we now have social media and multiple media platforms that disseminate or perhaps highlight the fact that these divisions exist even at the local level? In other words, your neighbor could be one sending, for example, Representative Adam Kinzinger appeared on TV this weekend showing a letter that was sent to his house threatening not only his death, but also his wife and his 5-month-old son. He put that on Twitter. He talked about it on television. Now the whole world knows about it. I guess the question is, has it always been there?
Well, I'm always hesitant to accept claims that this is completely new. It's never been this way. Well, there's nothing new under the sun. You're quite right. Obviously, there were very prominent assassinations in the 1960s, including ones that were clearly politically motivated. There have also been always death threats. Threats are a far more common thing than outright violence, although, of course, they can be quite menacing. These days, it's just easier than ever to send a threat. You don't even need to buy a stamp and to write a letter. You can just send an email or tweet something or what have you. So that might have increased things in some measure. When it comes to outright violence, it's true it's not unprecedented. But I will tell you that in the time that I've been really conscious of American political life, basically from the 1970s to the present, throughout much of that time, there was very, very harsh rhetoric against President Reagan. There was in some measure against President Clinton. But my sense is that there was somewhat less of this outright political violence than we've been seeing recently. And also, there was somewhat less division in Congress and in the country as a whole. It was somewhat easier for politicians to reach consensus. There was somewhat more talking across the aisle than now. Again, I'm not saying what's going on now is unprecedented, period, but I do think we have hit a low point after a period, say in the 1990s. You were saying, well, when I was clerking, same year, by the way, as Justices Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, then now justices, then they're just law clerks, in 93, 94, and that was sort of an era of good feeling, more or less. I mean, lots of Republicans didn't like Clinton, for example, but I don't think we had the same kind of bitterness and a violent rhetoric when it came to a lot of political matters.
So then, what can be done to sort of cool things off a bit? I was trying to think of what had been done in the past, what occurred in the past, and I don't know if the answer is in politics. Maybe the answer is in the economy. If everyone's got jobs and they're happy, they're just less likely to gripe about what the politicians are doing. But how do we cool things off a bit?
Right, it's very hard to tell. I don't know if anybody has the answer. I certainly don't have the answer. I mean, people have said that it's probably better if we, just in our own ordinary rhetoric, if we tone things down a bit. If we say, the people whom we're arguing against are mistaken. They're not evil. They're not horrible people. They just have a different and wrong, perhaps, view of seeing the world, but it's something where we should try to talk to them and persuade them rather than try to demonize them. That's probably better. That's what I try to do in my own discussions. I think this is often the best way of persuading people as well, actually, is to say, look, here's why the other side is mistaken, rather than I'm good, they're evil. This having been said, we have freedom of speech in America, and a lot of people, and that includes the right to speak very bitterly and harshly and contemptuously, and accuse people of being tyrants and being oppressors and being complicit in all sorts of horrible crimes. These accusations are levied by the left and the right, and sometimes by the center. So I'm not sure how much is going to be done about that. I think for all of us, it would be nice. I think it would be good in a lot of dimensions if we tried to ask ourselves, why does the other person have the views they have, whether pro-abortion rights, whether anti-abortion, whether pro-gun rights, whether anti-gun? Just think, maybe this is a well-intentioned person that just happens to have reached what we think is a morally or pragmatically incorrect result, rather than this is a horrible, evil oppressor. But again, I can't see what we can do to actually change that rhetoric among people who engage in that rhetoric.
Professor, you said there's nothing new under the sun. I think you went as retro as possible. You're talking about the golden rule. Just treat other people the way you would want to be treated. Not that complicated.
It's not that hard.
And definitely not that new.
Well, it's certainly good advice in many ways. But I think a little bit more specifically than that, I think it's a matter of thinking that a lot of human disagreements come not because one person is good and one is evil, but because they have different views of thinking about the world. That doesn't mean that all those views are equally right. All of us, of course, think some views are better than others, and perhaps some of us are correct. But I think the line that I've heard is just don't ascribe to malice what can be explained by just error, by just mistake, by disagreement.
Good point.
Very good point. Professor Volokh, thank you so much as always. We appreciate it.
As always, very much my pleasure.